laid out the thesis, which is that we have been deluding ourselves about how this extreme version of capitalism that seeks to deregulate everything, privatize everything, cut all those services that actually help people while augmenting those government services that are involved in disciplining, imprisoning, protecting our borders, waging wars, increase. We've been deluding ourselves about whether or not this has been a peaceful process. I think we know that the early stages of capitalism were extremely violent, and involved very violent expropriation and the use of force. The colonial process is extraordinarily violent. But we, too many of us, I think, deluded ourselves about whether this most recent stage of capitalism, the neoliberal era, just really the past 35 years, whether or not this was a peaceful and democratic process. So what I did in the shock doctrine is provide an alternative history of how violence was part of the imposition of neoliberalism from the start. But even after we exited the era of the coup d'etats in Latin America and the explicit violence and the use of torture to disappear and discipline the left, there was this tactic that was used over and over again by the people who I'm calling market fundamentalists, which was to exploit particularly economic crises, but other kinds of crises as well, natural disasters, moments of profound dislocation, when people regress, tend to trust the experts. These became moments when you could make the argument that we don't have time for democracy, we don't have time for deliberation, we have to centralize power, and we have to push through policies that we don't have a democratic mandate. But one thing I've really come to question is this idea that there is going to be a shock and it's going to jolt us into this amazing progressive action, even though I've seen it. I by no means believe it's inevitable, and I'm much more worried about the opposite, which is that this current wave of crisis, ecological and economic, are actually, if we are not careful, going to be catalysts for a deepening of a corporatist worldview and a deeply divided world. And I think there's reason to believe that if we look at the ways in which we have already responded to some recent crises. I'm thinking obviously of the financial crisis, and there was that sort of moment where I think a lot of us thought, okay, we have finally gotten the message, we have seen this incredible greed and mismanagement at the top. Obama was elected promising a rebuilding of the real economy, green jobs, all of this stuff that I'm sure resonated here. And it wasn't that there wasn't popular support for it. There was. In fact, Obama really started winning that election. For a while, it didn't look like he was going to win. But he really started winning that election when he started talking about rebuilding Main Street, the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street, the failed model of giving more and more to the people at the top and waiting for it to trickle down. And John McCain lost that election when he said the fundamentals of this economy are strong. And people said, no, they aren't. They are not strong. There's something fundamentally wrong, and we want to get at those fundamentals. That was the issue over which the 2008 election was fought. There are many examples, and I think that we can't be naive about how climate change can be a profit-making opportunity. Monsanto is marketing climate-ready seeds. I just came back from the World Social Forum in Dakar, where the theme of the forum was the new scramble for Africa, and it was all about land grabs that are taking place across the continent under the guise of green development, whether it's protecting forests so that you can get carbon credits and pushing people who are living sustainably off of those forests, off of the land, or biofuels, or countries taking huge pieces of land to ensure their food security at the expense of Africa's food security. So the ultimate example of this is techno fixes like geoengineering, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, but this is actually the reason I'm in the UK at the moment, is to attend a conference hosted by the Royal Society next week, where they're discussing solar radiation management, which is managing the sun. The idea that climate change really is just a kind of a temperature problem, right? It's just that it's too hot. So this is the ultimate engineering challenge, is just to physically turn down the heat by turning down the sun, by pumping sulfur into the upper atmosphere. I don't think that we can wait for the shock to wake us up. If we want the transformation, the kind of transformation that many of us have been working towards, dreaming of, believe in, we can't wait for it to happen in some magnificent jolt. We have to plan for it and model it, which is precisely what you're doing here, and what's so remarkable, and what's so important about the transition town process is that we need to have these models. We need to be able to see them. You know, I have this quote that I've used a lot in the shock doctrine from Milton Friedman, where he said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change, and when that crisis occurs, the change depends on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to keep the ideas ready until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And somebody quoted that to me today, describing what's going on here, which is that ideas will be around. There will be a model for people to point to, and that will be an alternative to this very frightening future that I'm laying out here of this privatized rescue. I call it rapture rescue, because it's almost like these sort of extreme Republicans in the United States are trying to enact the rapture down here on Earth, where certain people get saved and the rest get left behind. The climate movement, such as it is, the global climate movement, the official climate movement, the climate movement that converged in Copenhagen and converges every so often, it's not just that it's not winning, it's that we are losing ground pretty dramatically, and it's happened pretty quickly. So you have these huge gatherings like Copenhagen, Cancun, and not only are they failing to come up with the kind of ambitious agenda that science demands in terms of emission cuts, but we actually are going backwards. The Copenhagen Accord is weaker than the Kyoto Protocol. It has less enforcement. And if you add up what governments are actually agreeing to, it's not the 2% temperature increase, which in of itself is crazy. It adds up to something like a 5 to 7 or even 9 degree increase. Then you have the legislative collapse in the United States, where environmental groups spent somewhere around $1 billion to try to pass a piece of legislation with cap and trade as its centerpiece, and it flopped spectacularly. It was a complete waste of resources, of time, of strategy. Not only is climate legislation now off the agenda in the United States, but the process of trying to sell this extraordinarily flawed strategy has actually discredited the entire idea of climate action in the eyes of a great many Americans, because it looked like what it was, which was another opportunity for crony capitalism. The whole thing looked extremely corrupt. It didn't connect with people's lives. Many people involved in climate justice work in the United States, meaning working in communities, mostly communities of color, and have been doing the really long, hard work of trying to connect climate to people's lives. So they're working next to a huge oil refinery, say, in Richmond, California, and saying, here there's a connection between the fact that your kids all have asthma and these cancer clusters in your community, and the fact that the planet is sick. And we need to make that connection. We need to shut down this refinery, and in the process, we're going to tackle climate change. And so there was a level of engagement with climate, because people saw that this wasn't just about polar bears. This wasn't just some big this abstract issue somewhere else. It had the potential to tangibly improve their lives. And then all of a sudden, over in Washington, they're making a deal where actually we don't have to close down our refineries here. Somebody else is going to plant some trees somewhere else. We'll pay someone else to do the hard stuff for us. And these communities have lost what it was that was making climate action real on the ground. In 2007, 71% of Americans believed that climate change was real and humans were causing it. And just 2 years later, that number had dropped to 51%. So a 20% drop in 2 years. That is big. We're seeing an even bigger drop in Australia, where they had actually gotten to the high 70s and dropped to the 40s in belief in climate change. Something really weird is going on here, because this is happening at the end of the hottest decade in history. So there is a complete disconnect between even people's lived experience. I mean, you think about Australia and how directly they are experiencing climate change, not just because of drought that, you know, one day turns Sydney red. I mean, we saw those pictures. That's a wake-up call. You'd think it would be, right? But also they're dealing with the reality of climate migration because of where they are in the world. Their neighbors live on islands that are disappearing. So for denialism to be soaring in that context, we really need to be talking about what is going on here, what is behind it. So I've been trying to delve into these statistics and understand them. And they're really, really interesting. And I think anybody who is involved in climate on any level has to understand what is going on with these numbers. And by the way, the UK is almost as bad. Canada, where I live, is a little bit better. But still, we're losing ground. What's interesting is that if you look at the polls around climate change just 5 years ago, it was not a partisan issue. That you would not know who believed in climate change and who didn't believe in climate change just by asking them who they voted for in the last election. It was much more closely tied to education. You know, if they were educated, if they knew about the science, they tended to believe in climate change. If they weren't, there was more skepticism. But it was not a left-right issue. That has completely shifted. So now I'm just going to talk about the US because this has been where most of the statistical research has been done. But what you see is that 71% of Democrats still believe in climate change. In fact, a belief in climate change among Democrats is increasing. So that massive drop, that floor falling out, is all happening on the right. It's all happening among Republicans. And Clive Hamilton, who's a political scientist that some of you may know in Australia, has written very well on this. And he wrote a book called Why We Deny the Truth About Climate Change, talking about how now, if you want to know someone's position about climate change, you do ask who you voted for in the last election or what their position is on abortion. People are defining themselves by their denial of climate change. It says something about them, something that they're proud of. It says something about who they are, and it says something about their worldview. If you look at where this climate denial movement, where it comes from, where its roots are, yes, a lot of it's funded by the Koch brothers, these oil billionaires in the United States, or Exxon has poured millions into the climate denial movement. But there are scientists who have really helped, mostly physicists, not climate scientists, who have lent legitimacy to this movement and are the reason why the denialists are able to say that there isn't scientific consensus, even though there's overwhelming scientific consensus. So there's been some really good research and writing about who these scientists are, and it's very revealing because their roots are in the Cold War. These are physicists who were part of building nuclear programs, building the atomic bomb, defending Star Wars, defined themselves as defending freedom, capitalism, same thing, from the threat of communism, and used a lot of dirty tricks in order to win those battles during the Cold War, and saw themselves as being in a battle with their scientific peers, because the scientific community broadly was anti-nuclear, very critical of projects like Star Wars, but these scientists were holding the line in a war. They saw themselves as warriors, as cold warriors. When the Cold War ended, there was a new enemy, and the new enemy was environmentalism. And it started with actually the anti-tobacco campaign, and a lot of these scientists switched from defending Star Wars to denying that there was a link between tobacco and cancer. Why? Because they saw the science as being a threat to freedom, just like communism was. Because if you took the science to its logical conclusion, then you had created an argument for an interventionist government, for government regulation, and which they saw as part of a slippery slope in the road to serfdom because they are market fundamentalists. Because they saw themselves still as being fighting a war, being on a war posture, it was acceptable to fudge the truth. So what you see is that the same group of scientists have gone from issue to issue to issue, whether it's nuclear winter, ozone, acid rain, and now the biggest issue of all, climate change. Now, where this ties in with the research around identity and denial of climate change is that the right does see climate change as a profound threat to their worldview. The discussion around climate change on the right is now entirely couched in terms like this is, a socialist conspiracy. This is an attempt to force redistribution of wealth from rich to poor. Environmentalists are watermelon. They're green on the outside and they're red on the inside. Or they're, as George Will said, it's a green tree with red roots. So this is the discussion that is happening on the right. I'm sure most of you tune it out. But I think it's important to tune it in a little and listen to what is being said. The fear is not of the science. It's the fear of the consequences of the science. If you believe the science, then you have to believe the actions that the science demands. And what are those actions? Well, one of them is you have to regulate the hell out of corporations. You'd have to start planning your economy like you're doing here. You have to break all of these rules. You have to reverse this 35-year trajectory of free trade and globalization because you have to relocalize your economy. And you can't do it alone. You need an international architecture to do it. So you need the United Nations, which is described as a world government on many of these websites. So in all of these ways, you see how the worldview is profoundly challenged. But more than that, when they say it is a threat to the American way of life, climate change is, if you really see it as more than a temperature problem, is a challenge to and this is why I think that these ideas are strongest in countries with a really powerful frontier ethos like the United States and Australia, where the idea of infinite growth, of infinite expansion is embedded into people's definitions of themselves and of their country. It is their mythology that is under threat. I think climate change challenges all of our mythology. That none of us are exempt from this. We have all grown up within stories of infinite expansion, of infinite growth, of saviors, of apocalypse and salvation. But I would guess that most people in this room have complicated relationships to those stories. We are aware that they're stories. We struggle with them as stories. We don't leap to defend those stories. So it makes sense that the denialism is strongest among the people that see themselves as torchbearers for these narratives. They have the most to lose. So while it's easy to sort of laugh at the paranoia of some of this stuff, calling it all a hoax and just dismissing all the science, I think it's worth really trying to understand why this is such a threatening idea. Because so far, the way the big green groups have dealt with this entire collapse of belief in this core issue is by pretty much pretending that it's not happening, or just that people are dumb and you need to explain it to them more slowly. You need to give scientists better media trainings, get them snazzier graphics, scare people more, and finally they will wake up. So you've seen two strains of responses, two main strains. One is just to keep your head down and focus on the science, the science, the science, treat this as a technical issue, pretend that there is not an ideological war going on, okay? Because it is being framed as an ideological war. You are coming after our worldview. Just ignore it. It's just about the science. So that's one way of doing it. And another way of doing it is to try to beat the right at their own game and say, no, this is fantastic for capitalism. We're going to have a green boom. It's going to be the best thing since the Industrial Revolution. And not dealing with these core issues that actually climate change is part of a broader ecological crisis about our entire worldview that believes that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. So we try to co-opt these, and this is where cap and trade fits in, the market solutions, and we try to beat the right at their own game, which is always a winning strategy. And this is the logical conclusion of energy security. Natural gas is now marketing itself as the secure, patriotic fossil fuel right in your backyard, and there's lots of it. I mean, there's enough of it to last for another 100 years, they tell us, and it's everywhere. In my country, Canada, we have the tar sands. This did not used to be counted as part of the global oil reserves. But based on an energy security argument, this is now being marketed literally as ethical oil. The Canadian government now markets the tar sands as ethical oil because it doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. So, a lot of our attempts to sort of beat the right at their own game end up backfiring disastrously. And the other way I think that we can get ourselves into a corner is if we don't have this broader argument about economic growth, about the broader ecological crisis, of which climate change is only the most dramatic example. Then we are just talking about temperature, and we're just talking about carbon, and then we've set ourselves up, I think, for these techno fixes like geoengineering. I think we need to maybe accept a little bit more division and confrontation in the environmental movement. I mean, this is one of the ways in which the environmental movement has often set itself apart from the left by saying that unlike all these other issues that are very divisive, this issue, the climate crisis in particular, affects everybody. We're all in this together, and this is beyond left-right, this is beyond ideology, and we can somehow gloss over these differences and not have debates about what our worldview is, what our deep values are. We can gloss over them. And I feel like by not having this discussion, we don't have anybody defending the alternatives in a coherent way. Climate change is a crisis that was created in the rich world, in the North. It was 150 years of our emissions that created the climate crisis. And the effects of climate change are overwhelmingly being felt in the global South. And in fact, in a cruel historical irony, in the parts of the world that actually contributed the very least, like sub-Saharan Africa, are the places that are most vulnerable to climate change. So the truth is that the demands from the global South for a just response to climate change, a response to climate change that recognizes the principle of historical responsibility, not a response that says we will never change, but a response that says you have to recognize that you created this crisis and you have to lead, and we will not bear this burden equally. That has been the single greatest stumbling block to climate action. It's the reason the US did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. They did not sign it because they said if China and India aren't doing it, then we're not doing it either. And there was not a principled discussion in the United States from the environmental movement making the case for why the argument for historical responsibility is a legitimate argument. The deep changes to our relationship with nature and to each other that are required to tackle climate change shouldn't be viewed as a punishment to fear, but as a kind of a gift. We're hungering for these types of transformations on many fronts, from spiritual to economic. We are living in the ravages of 35 years of neoliberalism, and it has left our communities frayed and our souls isolated. Climate change, by threatening our very survival, I believe can serve as a catalyst to finally rise to these challenges. What climate change offers is a chance to solve the ecological and economic crises simultaneously so that we avert ecological chaos by changing an economic model that is already in need of serious transformation. In fact, changing our economy in some fundamental ways, well beyond a few token green jobs, is our only hope of combating climate change. All of these changes are ones that different progressive movements have long fought for on their own merits, quite apart from the climate crisis. But what climate change means is that these are battles that we simply cannot afford to lose. Thank you.
Oh, it's just another day on earth. It's just another day.